Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Wallace Collection's February seminar in the history of collecting. My name's Suzanne Higgett, and I'm one of the curators at the Wallace Collection, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this seminar. I'm also delighted to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Caroline Dakers. Dr. Caroline Dakers is a Professor Emerita at the University of Arts, London, which is, according to its Chancellor, Grayson Perry, the world's biggest factory for making trouble. I'm not expecting Caroline to make trouble this evening, but I do think that her subject, Millionaire Shopping, the collections of Alfred Morrison, 1821 to 1897, is going to make for a fascinating talk. Caroline's research into Alfred Morrison and his family goes back a long way. In 2011, she published her book, A Genius for Money, Business, Art and the Morrisons. From that book, I learned that Alfred Morrison's wife, Mabel, was on a committee with Sir Richard Wallace in 1884 to promote the survival of the Irish lace industry. Caroline's career has been punctuated by publications about the Morrisons and about Fonthill, William Beckford's Wiltshire estate, part of which would come into Alfred Morrison's ownership. Caroline has published widely on British art and collecting in the later 19th century. She's also held an array of teaching and lecturing posts and supervised and examined numerous PhD candidates. She's a member of the Advisory Council of the Paul Mellon Centre for British Studies. Caroline currently has several research projects in progress and is the editor of and principal contributor to the forthcoming book, The Collections of Alfred Morrison, 1821 to 1897, Millionaire Shopping, which will probably be published next year. And it is, of course, on this subject that Caroline is speaking to us today. During and after Caroline's talk, please send in any questions you have, as Felix has already mentioned. If you have any questions for Caroline, please send them through the Q&A. And I'm delighted now to invite you, Caroline, to present your lecture, Millionaire Shopping, the Collections of Alfred Morrison, 1821 to 1897. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Suzanne and Felix. So I hope you can all hear me clearly. And it's a great pleasure to be talking almost at the Wallace tonight. So to begin, Alfred Morrison was one of the most important and unusual collectors of the 19th century in Britain. He amassed not just one, but a number of major collections: engraved portraits, Chinese porcelain, contemporary paintings and sculpture from Britain, Northern Europe and North America, old masters, coins and medals, exquisite and elaborate pieces of virtu made for him by European craftsmen, and autograph letters. His London and country houses had interiors of unusual and striking designs by Owen Jones. The breadth of his interests reveal an unusual openness to and curiosity about cultures from around the world, while the collaborations between him and Owen Jones are unique in terms of style, cost, and the rapport between patron and designer. This talk is informed by the ongoing project involving 15 collaborators from the UK and North America, leading to a book on Alfred Morris collections to be published by UCL Press, free online, hopefully next year. And I'm both the editor and a contributor to that. So I'm making use here of others' research that is slowly emerging as the project takes forward. So thanks to all of them, and a few are noted actually on my slides as we go through. Also thanks to Christie's for help with the images, both new photography and access to their catalogues. Christie's have been selling to and selling for the Morrison family since the 1820s. And finally, thanks to Alistair Morrison, Lord Margadale, Alfred's direct descendant, for his support for the project and access to the family's archive and their archivist, John Darcy. So my talk has 5 parts. I look at Alfred's background, the context for his collecting, his inheritance, and I give a brief biography, the range of his interests, the display, and finally the dispersal of much of the collection. And inevitably, I'm going to be skating over the surface of the collections. My aim here is to indicate the extraordinary range of objects that Alfred acquired and to provide a taste of the riches he surrounded himself with. Alfred was the second son of the Napoleon of shopkeepers, millionaire, merchant, radical, MP and collector, James Morrison, born in 1789, who was dubbed at his death in 1857, the richest commoner in Britain. James's fortune was self-made. He was born in a Hampshire inn and apprenticed when a boy to a haberdasher in the city of London. He turned the moderately successful Fore Street warehouse into a world-leading business, investing profits in houses, land, works of art, and infrastructure projects across North America. His own merchant bank, J. Morrison & Co., had a global reach, trading in tea from Canton and cotton from New Orleans. When he died in 1857, his fortune was over £4 million. He owned over 100,000 acres of Britain, including the estates of Basildon, Fonthill, Malham, Isla, and Hull Park in Kent. Alfred was educated at Bruce Castle in Tottenham, the progressive school established by Rowland Hill, followed by 3 years at Edinburgh University and 1 year at Trinity College, Cambridge. He also travelled extensively in Europe and North America with his family and on his own. From 1831, the Morrisons lived at 57 Harley Street in London and the Fonthill Park Estate in Wiltshire. The Fonthill Park Estate was no ordinary property. The pavilion at Fonthill was the surviving wing of Alderman Beckford's Palladian mansion, Fonthill Splendens, here in the painting by Henry de Cour, commissioned by his son, William Beckford, in 1791. Splendens was made redundant by the building of the astonishing Fonthill Abbey by William Beckford. The remnants of the abbey remain close by, but from the mid-1840s, they were owned by Richard Grosvenor, Marquess of Westminster. And the Grosvenors not only had large estates in London and Cheshire, but also in Wiltshire and Dorset. And here you get an idea of the sites of Beckford's own Fonthill Abbey within his 7-mile wall, and James Morrison's pavilion, much, much smaller, of course, within the boundary of the first Fonthill estate, which had been created in the 16th century by the Mervyn family. James Morrison and then Alfred after him enlarged their estate to the north, to the east, and to the south. The history of the estate mattered to James and to Alfred. James bought several pieces from William Beckford's sales in Bath. Alfred, possibly his father before him, owned 3 paintings of the early mansion at Fonthill that preceded Splendens. 2 by Antonio Joly had been commissioned by Alderman Beckford when he bought the estate in 1745, and all 3 were in William Beckford's collection. Alfred continued to buy pieces from William Beckford's collection. Here, the famous Rubens vase, sold at the 1882 Hamilton sale to Samuel Wertheimer, then in 1892 to Alfred. And Alfred undoubtedly saw himself as heir to Beckford, not just in terms of his estate at Fonthill, but even more his role as a collector. And these slides, if you haven't been down to the Fonthill estate, these slides give you an idea of the beauty of the Fonthill estate landscape, also the giant arch created by the alderman to be seen clearly from the Turnpike Road, passing by from Salisbury to the West Country. But note, this is now an emptied landscape. There is no visible evidence of the alderman's house or the mansion that preceded it. The park contained grottos constructed for the Beckfords. James Morrison provided his children with boats to sail on the lake. It was a pleasure ground for Alfred, just as it had been for the young William Beckford. In 1838, James Morrison bought the Basildon estate in Berkshire. It became the Morrisons' principal country seat in about 1844, and Fonthill would then become the home of Alfred. In all the houses in London, in Berkshire, and in Wiltshire, Alfred was surrounded by his father's growing collection of old masters and contemporary paintings, which included works by Rembrandt and Poussin, by Constable, and by Turner. Alfred met with the dealers who attended auctions and acquired paintings for his father, and with the architect J.B. Papworth, who worked for all his father's properties, both residential and commercial. Gustav Wagen listed the collections in Harley Street and in Basildon, and there are also inventories made at the death of James Morrison in 1857. Unfortunately, no inventory was made of the contents of the pavilion at Fonthill when Alfred inherited it. An obituary summed up Alfred. In London, he was a man of high cultivation and an accomplished Maecenas. In Wiltshire, he was a model squire and a perfect country gentleman. And it's important, I believe, not to forget his passion for the Fonthill estate, for the land, for rural affairs and rural sports, another side to his character and life, but which is reflected in his taste for paintings and sculptures of animals. Following James Morrison's decision to make Basildon the family's principal country home, the architect David Brandon was commissioned in 1846 to carry out major building works at Fonthill. The pavilion was doubled in size with the additions of a tower, a portico, a servants' wing, a morning room, and a conservatory. It was turned into a desirable gentleman's country seat to rival the neighbours. In 1850, Alfred was formally offered the Fonthill estate by his father, together with the annual rental income of £4,000 and investments in American railways and canals that brought in about £7,000. And he was 29 years old at the time. After the death of his father, Alfred's estate was confirmed and his holding in investments was increased to £750,000. By the 1870s, his income tax returns suggest that Alfred's annual income had risen to £120,000. He enlarged his household at Fonthill to 7. He took bachelor lodgings in London at 34 St James's Place, Mayfair. He was close to the clubs of Pall Mall and the luxurious shops of Mayfair. He would become a member of the Reform and a founder member of the Savile Club, established for interesting men, and the Burlington Arts Club. It's clear that Alfred was not particularly interested in buildings as architecture. He wanted spaces in which to display his ever-growing collections. However, he did engage in the 1860s George Devey to design new cottages on the Fonthill estate and to make the approach walls to Alderman Beckford's great archway both higher and grander, adding 2 large piers. Devey's commissions, just before he was at Fonthill, included buildings for the Duke of Sutherland at Cliveden and Baron Rothschild at Menton. So Alfred was engaging an architect with social credentials. In 1863, Alfred applied for a lease on 16 Carlton House Terrace, one of the last dwelling houses of the first class, designed by John Nash to be built adjacent to the former site of Carlton House, the luxurious residence of Prince Regent. The first western section of the terrace had been completed by 1833 to Nash's designs. However, the eastern section was not completed until 1864, an interval of more than 30 years, by the contractor Samuel Morton Peter. In 1866, at the age of 45, Alfred decided to get married. None of his 5 brothers showed signs of having any children whatsoever. If Alfred married in order to secure the Morrison family line, his choice of a very young bride was wise, but not without risks. Mabel Chermside was 18 years old when she married Alfred at St James's, Piccadilly, on the 12th of April, 1866. She was the daughter of the rector of Wilton. The age gap of 27 years was considerable. Alfred was, however, very rich, and Mabel was an unusual young woman. She'd spent part of her childhood in Paris with her grandfather, Sir Robert Chermside, physician to the English embassy and the personal doctor of the elderly Marchioness of Hertford. Mabel's father, the Reverend Richard Seymour Conway Chermside, was named after the important collector, Richard Seymour Conway, 4th Marquess of Hertford. Mabel gave birth to 5 babies in the first 7 years of their marriage. 4 survived, including 2 boys, an heir and a spare for Alfred. In 1870, the family moved into Carlton House Terrace, together now with 16 servants. Around 1874, Mabel became virtually bedridden. The few clues to her physical condition suggest a gynecological problem, perhaps a prolapsed womb. She'd begun to pursue her own cultural interests, ancient jewellery, needlework and lace, joining the Council of the Royal School of Art Needlework. But she was forced to retreat into the background, remaining an invalid for 12 years or more. Her influence, consequently, on Alfred's collecting and her own collecting is still the subject of speculation. Alfred died on the 22nd of December, 1897, and was buried at Holy Trinity Church, Fonthill, Gifford. His chest tomb is the largest and grandest tomb in the churchyard, and presumably he commissioned the design before he died, but from whom we don't know. Alfred relied on a small number of men to help build his collections. Marseille Middleton Holloway, at 25 Bedford Street, Covent Garden, was one of the first dealers to help build Alfred's collection of portrait engravings, including works by Rembrandt, Hogarth, and Dürer. By 1868, when Holloway catalogued the collection, it comprised almost 3,000 engravings. And Holloway, by then, had been joined by his son, also called Marseille. And the number is important to remember. Alfred went in for large-scale collecting, numbers of engravings, numbers of coins and medals, numbers of pieces of Chinese imperial porcelain. And Alphonse Thibodeau became involved from the early 1880s as cataloguer of Alfred's autograph collection, which he began collecting in the 1860s. And Thibodeau produced, in the end, some 13 volumes of catalogues. Many of the prints that Alfred collected are both interesting and rare early prints, and many are now held by leading museums across the world. Here are 3 examples now in the British Museum. Mabel, and we will come back to this, sold the majority of the collection between 1901 and 1906. The majority are portraits of the famous and the powerful, linking them to Alfred's choice of autograph manuscripts, his old masters, and his coins and medals. The famous and the powerful seem to have attracted him over anything else. Other dealers were involved in acquiring prints and watercolours. Here, Thomas Whitehead of Duke Street in 1865, listing watercolours of a dead jay and the wing of a kingfisher by Dürer for £250, and the drawing of Nonsuch Palace for a further £50. Both Holloway and Alphonse Thibodeau were involved in collecting and then cataloguing Alfred's vast collection of autograph manuscripts. And here, I give you just a few examples. From the British Library, letters by Bernini and Benvenuto Cellini, and from the National Library in Scotland, the last letter of Mary Queen of Scots, in which she writes to Henry III, the King of France, "Sire, I have finally been condemned to death by her and her estates. I've asked for my papers, which they've taken away in order that I might make my will, but I've been unable to recover anything of use to me, or even get leave either to make my will freely or to have my body conveyed after my death, as I would wish, to your kingdom, where I had the honour to be queen, your sister, an old ally." Not surprisingly, the Royal Commission on Historical Manuscripts was so impressed by the collection that they wrote that it may be described in the language of moderation as the most remarkable gathering of historic autographs ever formed by a single private collector in Great Britain. Alfred began collecting Chinese porcelain in 1861-2, initially just about 1,000 pieces. He went on to spend a further £40,000 in just 5 years, acquiring hundreds more pieces, mostly this time through the dealer Durlacher in Bond Street. The story that Alfred bought a whole shipload of porcelain from Henry Locke, who'd been involved in the sacking of the Summer Palace in 1860, looks most likely to be no more than a story. The jeweller, Robert Phillips of 23 Cockspur Street, acted as an intermediary for Alfred at the International Exhibition in 1862, and his firm drew up a list covering 6 pages of Alfred's purchases, totaling over £7,500. And Phillips continued to be an extremely important figure for Alfred. Names will recur from the exhibition: Charles Lepec, Bob Edienne, and of course Jackson and Graham and Owen Jones. And Jones' own design for a dairy at Fonthill, commissioned by Alfred's father James, but never built, was on display at the exhibition. Alfred also lent pieces to the exhibition and was already being described as a significant collector. He spent the most on any one object on this ebony cabinet by Fourdenois. Alfred bought much of his contemporary British art through the Royal Academy's summer exhibition, relying perhaps on the Academy's seal of approval. But once struck by a particular artist, he would seek out more works, visiting studios, building close relationships, none more so than John Brett. And from 1864, Alfred went on to collect some 30 works by Brett. He paid Brett guineas when Brett asked for pounds. He proposed ideas for paintings. He paid in advance of completion, and he commissioned drawings of himself and his wife, Mabel. Alfred's American collection is of particular interest. It is pretty unusual for the date. He was inspired very much by his early traveling in North America. Between 1842 and 1845, Alfred was in North America part of the time with his elder brother Charles, but for the most part traveling on his own, crisscrossing the continent from Boston to New Orleans, Cuba to Upper Canada. The young men were working for the family merchant bank, Morrison Sons and Company. In New York, he was struck by the house of William Shepherd Wetmore, a China merchant and business colleague of his father. The house was full of Chinese curiosities and very beautiful. So perhaps he was first interested in Chinese porcelain from this visit. Alfred was also visually and intellectually stimulated by the North American continent. Watching the sunset from a rock overhanging the Horseshoe Fall at Niagara was an event in a man's lifetime, he wrote. He visited America again just after his father's death, and thereafter bought paintings and sculpture by contemporary American artists. He'd seen Jasper Cropsey's work at the 1862 International Exhibition and bought 11 works through Marseille Holloway at Cropsey's sale in London in 1863. Alfred inherited a few of his father's old masters, including a Van Dyck and a Rembrandt, but his own purchases were relatively small in number. He didn't have the buying power of a Wallace or a Rothschild. His taste was undoubtedly for portraits of significant historical figures. And here in 1872, he bought Bronzino's Cosimo de' Medici, a powerful leader, but also a great collector. And he acquired this very early portrait of Queen Elizabeth I, most unusual, and which has been recently restored and examined afresh. So what did he do with all these objects, the thousands of pieces of porcelain, the thousands of engraved prints? We don't know very much because the evidence really doesn't survive, but there are some clues, some hints as to how he managed. So here we've got a side view of Fonthill House, which shows the conservatory, and you can make out in the image that it's stuffed with statuary and porcelain. And the photograph was taken before 3 galleries were added in the 1880s. And here is a plan of Fonthill House before the galleries were added, but after it had been extended by David Brandon. Owen Jones, working for Jackson and Graham, designed these extraordinary display cabinets to hold Alfred's Chinese porcelain. They also designed further pieces of furniture and furnishings and the interior decorations for Fonthill House from about 1862 to 1864. So here, if you look at the curved cabinet, it was designed to fit at the curved end of the dining room, which is in the plan over on the left side. It was part of a suite of furniture, together with the chimney piece, all of ebony inlaid with ivory. The ceiling, according to the builder, was of wood, panelled and inlaid with mouldings of black and gold. There are no images, however, of the inside of this part of Fonthill House, only of the galleries. So we only have, as I say, a few clues as to what it really looked like. In London, in Alfred's house in Carlton House Terrace, Owen Jones, Jackson and Graham were given even more of a free hand, and they were engaged from about 1865 to produce the interior decorations, fittings, furniture and furnishings. After the 1862 International Exhibition, Charles Lepec, the French enamellist, became a close friend of Alfred. A bedroom at Fonthill House was named after him, and he spent 2 years making the exquisite fire surround for Carlton House Terrace, plus numerous tazos, enamel pictures and elaborate frames. And here you can see that fire surround in one of the rooms at Carlton House Terrace. And Lepec benefited, like Owen Jones, from having his work sent by Alfred to international exhibitions and winning prizes. And of course, Alfred's good taste and his wealth was at the same time on show. And here's an example of the many multicolored coffered geometrical ceilings that were installed through the ground and first floor rooms of 16 Carlton House Terrace, and most are still intact in the house. And then examples of the furniture that we know were in Carlton House Terrace: a bookcase and the piano case of the Erard piano, which is now in Sowerby Museum. By 1880, it was clear that Alfred had run out of space in London. Application was made to the Crown Estate, who owned the property, by Jackson and Graham to build 3 galleries on the top of Carlton House Terrace, but the scheme was rejected. In 1884, the architects Gordon and Lowther were commissioned to build a new picture gallery at Fonthill. 3 top-lit galleries were eventually built, set into the hill immediately behind Fonthill House. Photographs were taken before Alfred's death in about 1890. The only pictures, as I've said, of the inside of Fonthill House. So here we have a picture of the saloon. with more of Alfred's collection of porcelain. And you get, I think, now a sense of the numbers of pieces that he owned, but also on the walls, he's had his engraved prints framed. So again, it's numbers, it's the scale, but also the colours of some of these pieces. Look carefully at the end of the saloon and take in those three pieces of sculpture at the end. And they are, on the left, Hiram Powers' The Greek Slave. On the right, Hiram Powers' Proserpine, examples of American sculpture acquired by Alfred. You've then got chandeliers by Benson, most likely, hanging from the ceiling. The wallpaper, well, I'd really love to know who designed that wallpaper. It doesn't seem to be Owen Jones. It's later, 1880s. So again, this is something that we are researching. And then in between, this life-size female figure holding a scroll, dated 1864, by Stefano Galletti. Again, what's happened to it? We know the Hiram Powerses were sold and the Galletti, 1899. But as I say, we don't know where they went. There was a version of the Hiram Powers' Proserpine at the 1862 International Exhibition. We often come back to that exhibition to see ideas that Alfred gathered for his collection later on. When Alfred died in 1897, his widow Mabel continued to live at Fonthill House until about 1910. She was left all of his collections apart from his list of heirlooms and would appear to have given their 4 children various pieces over the years she remained at Fonthill. Alfred's probate was agreed in 1898 at £869,000 and resworn in 1900 at £900,000. Death duties amounted to just under £10,000, which Mabel recovered in the first 3 sales of Christie's in 1898. Sales of embroideries, rugs, intaglios, gold rings, Greek vases. However, Mabel continued to sell an astonishing number of objects. 7 sales in 1899, 7 more between 1901 and 1906, including much of Alfred's collections of contemporary paintings, sculpture, and his engraved prints. And his very large collection of autograph letters was sold through 4 sales during the First World War. And she also disposed of 16 Carlton House Terrace. So let's look at a little bit more detail of some of the objects that travelled from Carlton House Terrace and Fonthill House out into the wider world, into private collections and into museums and art galleries. So here is a slide of the picture gallery at Fonthill House, again taken in about 1890. The picture gallery was dominated by contemporary British paintings and damascene urns by Placido Zuloaga. And if you can make it out, look in particular, hanging on the right wall at the far end, the higher picture is Leighton's Summer Moon. And then look to the left at the special cabinet by Zuloaga in between the vases, the very large vases on the left. And here we've got details. So Frederick Leighton's Summer Moon, bought by Alfred Morrison at the Royal Academy, or just before, in 1872. And we know it was hanging in Carlton House Terrace in 1879. It was described as being there by Mrs. Howes. By 1890, it was in Fonthill House in the picture gallery. Sometime between Alfred's death and 1920, it came into the ownership of his younger son, Archie, who inherited Basildon from his childless uncle, Charles Morrison, Alfred's elder brother. In 1920, it was sold by Archie out of Basildon House to the Indian cricketer, K.S. Ranjit Singh, and is believed still to be in his family's palace of Nawanagar. Placido Zuloaga, the master of Spanish damascene, eventually made over 30 pieces for Alfred, like John Brett and like Charles Lepec. Zuloaga's relationship was close and lasting many years. Alfred undoubtedly wanted to own as much of the Spanish craftsman's output as he possibly could. It was almost as if he was trying to stop anybody else owning any of the work. Zuloaga's son Ignacio painted Alfred and Mabel. The majority of the Zuloaga pieces were listed in Alfred's heirlooms list, so Mabel was not able to sell them. She only had control over the pieces outside the heirlooms list. It was Alfred's grandson, John Granville Morrison, in the 1960s and 1970s, who sold many of these pieces, coinciding with the collecting interests of Dr. Nasser Khalili. Hence, they are now in the Khalili collection, the Spanish damascene metalwork. I've mentioned that Alfred collected hundreds upon hundreds of coins and medals, very many of them depicting, as I've already said, the famous, the powerful. And here, an example from the British Museum. This rather strange desk, and I'll take you back to that slide. On the left, the front of it has been shut, so you can't see all the many drawers inside. If we go down to this, it's called a writing desk because it would have been placed on top of a table, the flap pulled out, and so you would have actually leant on the table onto that flap. But those little drawers were not for a conventional writing desk, but would have contained many of the coins and medals in his collection. And this sold by John Granville Morrison in 1966 and now in the Khalili collection. This is the music gallery. So we've had the three, the saloon, the picture gallery, and now the music gallery. And over the fireplace, you can see John Brett's Christmas Morning, which I showed you in an earlier slide. And in the far end of this gallery, we've got the painting A Panic by H.W.B. Davis, A Panic Charging Cows. Also taken on the near left side, on the tables, all these exquisite objets d'art, in particular, a coupe by Charles Durand. And here we have the details, the Panic and the beautiful coupe. Davis, who painted the Panic, was regarded as the heir of Landseer. The Panic was shown at the Royal Academy in 1872. It was 8 feet high and 16 feet wide and was regarded as the largest painting of Capel in the whole world. Alfred possibly was tempted to buy it because of that. He also owned other paintings by Davis and Davis's sculpture, The Trotting Bull. And here I think we see very much Alfred's interest in domestic animals that connected him back to the Fonthill Estate and his interest in rural life. A Panic was hanging in the music gallery when Philip Burne-Jones, son of Edward Burne-Jones, painted Alfred's portrait. He was unimpressed by Alfred's taste, writing in a letter, "Their gallery of pictures was the most depressing thing of all. I'd never quite realized what unlimited wealth combined with bad taste could achieve. Do you remember that vast canvas of life-size cows coming full tilt at one, with a thunderstorm raging in the background? It got on my nerves and I wondered whether my portrait would look like the cow picture when it was done. But they were kind and hospitable, and everyone needn't have good taste, need they?" Alfred's patronage of Davis coincided with the artist's election to the Royal Academy. Davis, in return, invited Alfred to the prestigious academic banquets held at the opening of the summer exhibition. The Durand coupe was sold by Alfred's grandson in 1971 and acquired by the Carnegie Museum in 2008. This is another view of the saloon, looking the other way. Here, again, look at the far end of the room and note the Italian sculpture of a goat and kid by Lombardi, which is now in Liverpool. Alfred had again seen work by Lombardi at the 1862 International exhibition. So he is remembering, he's recalling, and he's seeking out works that he's familiar with. Also, note the praying girl to the right at the far end of the gallery, and the sculpture of the infant Bacchus to the left. So here we have a slide which brings together this complicated story, really, of where all these objects go to. So the figure of the praying girl, which is on the left, is by Santarelli, and it was in a Christie's auction in 1899, being sold by Mabel, but it then reappears at Basildon in 1910. So this is a photograph of the interior of Basildon in about 1910. The Wyatt sculpture of the infant Bacchus was sold in 1899. And incidentally, Wyatt showed work, or his work was shown, he was already dead, his work was shown at the 1862 International Exhibition. The enamelled vase by Charles Lepec, made for Alfred, would seem to have been acquired by Alfred's son, Archie, and reappears in the sale catalogue for Basildon in 1920. And you can see the invitation to the sale. And then on the right, a table. It's an illustration from the catalogue, and you can see the vase on the table itself. And this is now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So it's a very complicated story that all of us producing essays for the book are trying to follow, in and out of auctions, in and out of private collections, and then public collections. Mabel, as I've said, moved out of Fonthill House around 1910, moving to Shawford House and Estate near Winchester. Her move itself may well have triggered the shifting of objects from Fonthill House to the homes of her 4 children. Her eldest son, Hugh, so fed up that his mother refused to leave Fonthill House any earlier, had meanwhile built himself a new home called Little Ridge on the other side of the lake at Fonthill. Surplus to requirements, Fonthill House was demolished in 1921. Some of the contents were taken to the new Little Ridge, and some were sold. And here you can see the landscape today with no sign of that house. Mabel had actually always advised her son to demolish the house when she would leave it. And she wrote, "When I think of the thousands of pounds wasted, electric light, water supply, galleries, etc., etc., I wring my hands in sheer despair." I think what that letter suggests is that Mabel was selling objects by the hundred because she did not care for a lot of Alfred's collection. But of course, that's surmise. We don't have any more evidence than the fact that she just did get rid of so many objects. After the demolition, Hugh Morrison renamed Little Ridge Fonthill House to make the story even more confusing. When Fonthill House was demolished, the Owen Jones cabinets went on their journey. They were bought by Mr. Borley of nearby Shaftesbury and fitted into Barton Hill House. Here, you can just about make out the far end of the photograph of the billiard room, the curved cabinet that I showed you in an earlier slide. When the house was acquired for Shaftesbury School in the 1980s, the Jones pieces were sold by Dorset County Council through Sotheby's and through Christie's, and they're now scattered across the world. The tall cabinet here is now in Toledo Museum in Ohio. Another piece is in the Dunedin Art Gallery in New Zealand. The story of the Fonthill Estate is one of houses being built, extended, demolished, not just by William Beckford, but by 3 generations of the Morrison family. Little Ridge, the house top left here, built by Hugh Morrison across the lake and confusingly renamed Fonthill House, lasted until 1971, just 50 years, before it was demolished to be replaced by a smaller neo-Georgian house. Christie's held 13 sales across 1971 alone, disposing of much of Alfred's collections that had remained at Fonthill. Alfred had acquired Richard Dad's Contradiction in 1870. Marseille Middleton Holloway bought it and a number of other paintings by Dad at the Christie's sale in 1870. Contradiction cost Holloway 135 guineas. And it was hanging in Carlton House Terrace in 1879 and described by a visitor as a painting of unhealthy nightmares. Later, around 1891, Alfred bought the Fairy Fellow's masterstroke, and at some time, the accompanying poem entitled Elimination of a Picture and its Subject, called the Fellow's masterstroke. Contradiction ended up at Basildon, but Archie sold it in 1920. By the 1950s, it was on display in the Royal Hotel Scarborough. It was most recently sold by Christie's in 1992 and bought by David Mason for Lord Lloyd Webber for £1,650,000. The Fairy Fella passed to Alfred's daughter Catherine Gatty, and by her to Siegfried Sassoon on the occasion of the poet's marriage to Catherine's daughter Hester. Sassoon eventually gave the painting to the Tate in 1963 in memory of his friend and fellow officer Julian Dad, a great nephew of the artist, and of his two brothers who all died in the First World War. The Elimination poem was found in a drawer of a desk at Fonthill House prior to the house being cleared for demolition in 1971 and sold at Christie's, then acquired by the Bethlehem Museum of the Mind. So just 3 examples of Richard Dad's work have taken very different journeys out of Alfred's collection. Taste plays a part not just in Alfred's collecting, but the things that have been done to the objects since his death, not just their values, but whether they are hidden away, whether they re-emerge. And the story of the Metropolitan Museum's attitude to 19th century objects is in itself a very interesting story. The Metropolitan Museum has been acquiring a number of pieces from Alfred's collection for over a century. First of all, engravings and etchings by old masters. But it's only recently that the museum has become interested in Alfred's 19th century pieces. The opening of the R.S. and B. Gerald Cantor galleries in 1991 for the display of 19th century European objects was key. And here we see the absolutely extraordinary table clock commissioned by Alfred in 1881 from Bapst and Lucien Falize, made of silver, enamel gold, hard stones, rock crystal, amethysts and diamonds. Sold by John Granville Morrison at Christie's in 1938 for £65, 2s, wrongly attributed to Placido Zuloaga. It was sold again in 1955 for $5,000 and then bought by the Met in 1991. Incidentally, it has Alfred's initials AM on one of the sides, and many of the objects that he owned, particularly Owen Jones's furniture, have the initials AM on them. Brett's watercolour of 1865, called Bonchurch Down, was sold by Mabel in 1899. She sold almost all the John Bretts that Alfred had collected. So again, this sense, she just didn't like these pictures. She didn't want to keep them. She didn't need the money, but she didn't want to keep the pictures. It was bought by the Met in 2015, so much, much later, and had a long journey on the way. And then Charles Lepec's enamel portrait of Mabel herself, made in 1866 by Lepec and with a frame by Placido Zuloaga, entered the Met collection in 2018. So it's a very interesting example of a collection like the Met suddenly taking interest in this sort of work that Alfred had collected 140 years before. My final slide shows Alfred amongst a crowd of the great and the good, a position he surely enjoyed. He was undoubtedly somebody with an addictive personality, acquiring not just one painting by an artist, but every painting he could lay his hands on, buying not just a few pieces of Chinese imperial porcelain, but several thousand, and so on. His obsession with famous men and women, acquiring their autograph letters, their images in old master portraits, in engravings, coins, and medals, may suggest a need for status in society. He also published catalogues of his engravings and his autograph letters, and lent pieces by Lepec, by Owen Jones. He lent coins and medals and paintings to exhibitions. Again, was this about making his mark as a collector of taste? Some answers will hopefully be found as the research progresses and the book comes together. He might well have enjoyed my comparing his collections to those of William Beckford as described by William Hazlitt. The specimens exhibited are the best, the most highly finished, the most costly and curious of that kind of ostentatious magnificence which is calculated to gratify the sense of property in the owner and to excite the curiosity of the stranger who is permitted to see or even touch baubles so dazzling and of such exquisite nicety of execution. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline, for that really beautifully organised and intriguing presentation with fabulous images as well. And I was really interested that you end up with this particular image at the end, because of course there's Richard Wallace in the centre foreground. So it's generally for all the people in it, it's a really fascinating painting. So thank you very much for for a fabulous presentation. And we've got a number of questions coming through. So please do continue to send in your questions through the Q&A. And I'll just start to read some of those out. So from Lynn Hulse, we have, did Alfred Morrison, like his wife Mabel, collect embroidery and lace?
So one of the contributors to the book is actually looking quite specifically at Mabel's collection, and she's been down to the Royal School of Needlework to see what's there and the links there. I think what we are understanding is that Alfred provided the money, and that Mabel was then able to pursue this as one of her own interests. So the house, apparently the house, Carlton House Terrace, was full of examples of embroidery, of lace. But maybe there's an opportunity to see that Mabel, developed her own line. She was certainly involved in helping to support the lace industry in Ireland. So she was quite active in the years that she was able to be. But it was Alfred's money.
Yes. So does that mean, do you know whether she sold her own, did she hold on to her own collection to these sorts of items when she was selling so many of Alfred's?
So she certainly sold some of the pieces of embroidery, some of the lace, but the auctions show that some of the materials actually carried on through to her children. So she didn't get rid of everything. And she took some pieces also to her house, Shawford House in Winchester. So that sort of makes it one feel that she was really interested in this.
Yeah. Yes. And Martin Levy's written in, interested to hear that the story about Alfred Morrison acquiring works from the Summer Palace may be just a story. Has new evidence come to light?
So this is Stacey, who's contributing again to the book, and she has been trying to really get back into where Alfred first bought his pieces, that 1,000 pieces that he got in the first year or so. And she's beginning to think that he might have been going to some of the big sales in Paris, as well as in London. And so, you know, there's this story that he was in the Travellers Club and somebody asked who was the richest man, you know, in the room. And he put his hand up, and he was then offered this shipload of porcelain to buy. But as I say, maybe it's just a nice story.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. Now, Barbara Hull wrote in during your talk to, so I'm not quite sure. Oh no, now I do know what she's talking about. Is the face on the coupe, on the bowl, of a particular person? It seems so realistic.
Actually, Martin Levy would be the expert to handle this. I think it's a satyr's head, not actually somebody, but as I say, it might be worth hunting back online and looking up the piece and going to the museum. I think it's a satyr's head.
Yeah, that's what it looked like to me, I must say. And then an anonymous attendee, do you have an image of Philip Burne-Jones's portrait of Morrison?
No, it was sold out of the collection in the 20th century, and I haven't been able to find it. I mean, if anybody, you know, has any idea where it might be, that would be so interesting. Yeah.
That's a great loss, actually, isn't it?
Yeah.
Another anonymous attendee, or possibly the same one. Did Alfred ever work at the family business? Did the business even exist during his lifetime?
Yeah, the business existed. The business was inherited by his elder brother, Charles. Charles was the one interested in finance, and he went on to leave a fortune of something like £13 million when he died in 1909. He carried on the business for a while into the 1860s, and then it became a limited company. So it carried on right into the 20th century. But I think only one younger brother was involved a little bit, but really the Morrisons moved back away from it. Alfred had no interest in finance. He liked his money. He liked spending it on his collections, but he'd made no money. Yeah, he was really not. When he went around America with his brother Charles, it was Charles who commented that Alfred, you know, had no interest in money. He liked being at ease. He liked his own interests. So yeah, not.
Do you have any sense of feeling for what he might have hoped to happen to his collection? Do you think he just wanted to preserve it in the catalogues that he produced rather than thinking of any long-term continuation of it? My impression is he married. I mean, maybe he married for love. Perhaps he married for love. But I think he married in order to have children, because he realized, as I said, that his 5 brothers were not going to have any children at all. They didn't. And in fact, there were very, very few nephews and nieces, and none in the Morrison family line. So I think he wanted the Morrison name to be attached to his collection. I think that by listing heirlooms, and there are hundreds of heirlooms, large amounts of the heirlooms are his coins and medals, his engraved prints, and his porcelain, not so many contemporary works. But by listing heirlooms, I think he was hoping they would be kept by the family forever, by his children's children. Some of them have, but a lot not. I think that, but he doesn't seem to have shown an interest, as far as we know, in telling his children about his collection. But the letters, family letters, have disappeared. There are no letters, or hardly any letters, between him and Mabel, hardly any letters between him and his children. And there's a sort of assumption that maybe Mabel destroyed a lot of that family material. So you made the point about the catalogues. He obviously wanted his achievement to be revealed to the world, the catalogues, the prints and the engraved, the autographs. I mean, it's quite interesting. After he died, there was a fair amount of criticism of the way that the autographs were catalogued. Some scholars thought that they were not accurately catalogued, and were critical of Thibodeau and Alfred Morrison. Thank you. And actually, Martin Levy has written in to say that he agrees with you about the satire's head on the whole. So thanks very much, Martin, for that. Chris Smith has asked, is there any evidence that Morrison was expert in any particular theme rather than amassing a wide collection?
I think the themes, animals, interesting, contemporary paintings and sculpture of domestic animals and wild animals. I mean, he had a Rosa Bonheur sculpture. He had sculptures of leopards, trotting bull, small sculptures by an artist I don't know much about called Barye, Barye, distributed all around Fonthill House. So animals, very important to him. He liked winning prizes at agricultural shows for his own sheep. So there's sort of competitive edge there, but certainly animals. And then the old masters, I think I mentioned the coins and medals, the engraved prints, the autographs, 16th, 17th century British aristocrats, the royal family, and then Renaissance princes, and then Roman sort of power. I mean, I think he liked power in his objects, you know, figures who were famous, women who were beautiful, men who were powerful. So there's something there. It's a theme that crosses quite a lot of objects. But I think, you know, we're teasing out more of this, I think, as we go along.
Thank you. And Judy Rudo has written in, here's the Durand ewer with satire head in the British Museum, and she's sent a link. And I don't know that people can see the link. I think Felix, you'll need to help out here. But she also says, wonderful lecture, thank you. So hopefully Felix might be able to tell us how we could spread around the link that Judy has very kindly sent in. And Felix has written to me by email to say that the ebony and ivory display furniture made for Morrison reminds him of the Alleg display tables in the Wallace collection, F477-8, and it tells us our record about those online on our website, that they were made around 1865 of oak, ebony, ivory, iron, brass and glass. And Sir Richard Wallace bought, we have a pair of them. He bought them after the Alleg sale in 1872. They'd probably been made for Alleg, of course, another very well-known Parisian collector in this case, for the display of his gold boxes and other small works of art. So I think what Felix is thinking that the comparison is interesting, and perhaps could there be a link, saying they share aesthetic values. And he also asks if Fonthill and Alfred's Carlton House Terrace house were accessible to other collectors and connoisseurs, and what was Alfred Morrison's attitude towards the study of his collection. So I know that there were some visitors to Carlton House Terrace. He allowed Mrs. Howes to go in and write a chapter in her Beautiful Houses book about it. I know that he allowed somebody in from the Magazine of Art, and he also allowed in this novelist called Florence Caddy, who wrote an essay about it, Millionaire's Townhouse. As we know about those three, it suggests there might have been others. He certainly allowed some of his social friends, and there's one visit particularly by the novelist George Eliot and her partner Lewis, because they had got Owen Jones to work on their house in Regent's Park, and Alfred and Mabel were invited to George Eliot's home for social events. So George Eliot and Lewis visited, and they were very rude about Alfred's collection. They didn't like him. They thought that he was really showing off too much, and that he seemed to think everything he had was great. So they're quite dismissive of him. Oh, and I think there's a comment in an exchange between the Rothschilds. It's in
an earlier book, again dismissive of Alfred's collections. A sort of jealousy, I don't know, but I think some people found him arrogant. His wife Mabel described him as being very shy. So, you know, arrogance and shyness can go together. So, yeah, I think people were allowed to come, but I think they were probably picked for certain reasons. The great and the good, or maybe particular journalists, people writing up the collections. Fonthill House, he had parties, his wife had parties, particularly towards the end of his life. So the local estates, the local villagers would come to the house. He actually allowed people from the Fonthill villages to go into the house. There are newspaper reports of people seeing his collection. So in that sense, he was quite open about what was there. What they thought of them, I don't know.
Thank you. Danielle Kisluk-Groschild has written in, thank you, Caroline, for your wonderful lecture. Mabel appears to have been a beauty. Perhaps he married her also as a beautiful woman to add to his collection in a way.
Well, that's where we get into sort of speculation, don't we? I mean, you know, if I was writing a novel about Alfred, he would definitely have been, you know, he collected Mabel and he stuck her inside these, you know, two houses full of all this, you know, all this stuff. But I think she felt she couldn't move. And then when he died, she got rid of it all and then moved off to another very large house with about 15 servants and had another sort of, I think, 30 odd years of life without him and without his collections. So, yeah, I think there's something there, maybe. What the proof would be, I don't know.
Susanna Avery Quash has asked, do you think Alfred Morrison was ever interested in historical portraits on account of the sitters' often ornate costumes or armour? In the case of the portrait you showed of Cosimo de' Medici by Bronzino, for example, linking to his interest in the decorative arts, including the metalwork by Spanish craftsmen and the elegant interiors by Owen Jones.
That's an interesting link. I mean, Susanna's part of my team, as is Danielle. So we're thinking all the time about this. Alfred did collect some armour. I think there's some in a collection in New Zealand, possibly. So, you know, he and I think Mabel was selling off quite a bit of armour at the Christie's sales in the 1890s. So it might be worth, you know, having a look at that. Very possibly embroidery, lace, costumes, they're there in the pictures. Yeah, I mean, it's very possible. We don't have letters from Alfred to anybody, I think, saying why he loves these objects. I mean, that's what's missing. You know, we have some letters from some of the designers and the artists to him, but not his letters. So Suzanne will have to work it out for herself.
I'm sure that will result in something very interesting. And Felix has asked, did Alfred and Mabel travel to Spain, possibly Madrid, to Toledo or Granada, to justify such passion for the damascene work of Zuloaga? It'd be fascinating to know more of that travel if it happened.
I don't know. Really don't know. Mabel kept no diaries, although they don't exist. We don't know how much they travel. When they married, they certainly went down to the south of France. So they obviously traveled to start with. Then, of course, she was having her 5 babies in 7 years. And then she was really quite bedridden for about 12 years. So I'm not sure about the traveling. I bet she traveled after he died.
So how do you think she kept involved with these committees if she was bedridden? I thought that was very interesting too.
That's interesting. I think that a lot of things were happening in London. I think, you know, before she was collecting the embroidery and the lace, just before she became ill, she emerges in the middle of the 1880s and she's there again. But there are accounts, Alfred, I think in some comment I've come across says, you know, she wasn't able to attend something. She did attend something else. So I think she was trying, she was managing. But also people probably came to Carlton House Terrace. I mean, Alfred after Owen Jones died, Alfred held a really important meeting with the leading architects of the time in Carlton House Terrace to discuss a memorial exhibition to Owen Jones. And I just suspect that maybe people came to Mabel's house and saw her collection and talked with her.
Thank you very much. And I had a couple of questions. I noticed that East Noyle was sort of close, not far from Fonthill on the map. And I just wondered whether the Morrisons had any contact with the Seymour family of East Noyle House, because of course Alfred Seymour, there was a sale of autographs from his collection, and his son Henry Danby Seymour then owned East Noyle House, and he lent to exhibitions. So I don't know if you know of any link there.
Now that's really interesting, because I only know the link between the Morrisons and the Wyndhams of Cloud's house. So, and the Wyndhams moved into Cloud's house really in the 1880s, and then became familiar figures at the Morrison parties, and the children knew each other quite well. So I didn't actually make that connection with Alfred Seymour, but yes, at Noyle House, selling the collection. No, have to pursue it.
Yes,
or my colleague will have to pursue it, who's looking at the autographs. Yeah, very interesting. I don't know. No. Thank you.
And I also wondered if you knew who took the photographs of the galleries in around 1890.
Okay, so they're in the collection of Historic England, and they are catalogued as being by Bedford Lemire. But Ian Leith, who is the Bedford Lemire expert there, has said that they aren't in the Bedford Lemire, their own inventory of what they took. So we think they're not by Bedford Lemire. There's no evidence Bedford Lemire went there, so we don't know.
Because I wondered if they could be by John Thompson, who took the photographs of the interiors of Hertford House in about 1888, who was quite a well-known pioneering photographer, traveling in Asia much earlier in his career, but he ended up in the 80s to 90s doing photographic work for in the context of their collections for a couple of the Rothschilds, and also for took these views of the galleries of the Wallace collection around 1888. So I just wondered.
That would be really interesting. I might try asking Ian what he thinks, but I mean, I should think Alfred would want the photographer to be significant. So the link with the Wallace collection, would be the right sort of link. I mean, they are wonderful photographs, because you can, I mean, you can't do it so much on the screen today, but you can blow them up and you can try and work out, what a lot of the pictures are. I mean, I've got great long lists of all the odd bits and pieces in those rooms. They are fantastic resource. There are, I think, 7 in all. So yeah, that's really helpful, and I'll pursue that. Thank you.
Thanks. And finally, I think for the Q&A, Judy Rudo's written in saying, in response, I think, to Felix's question, see Lady Layard's diary, 29th of February, 1872, Madrid, on the Zaloga chest for Morrison. On the Zaloga chest for Morrison. She and Henry go to see it. So Lady Layard's diary, 29th of February, 1872, should be helpful. Oh, and Martin Levy, apologies for another comment. That's great to hear from you, Martin. I think that Alfred Morrison first encountered Zaloga at the 1862 exhibition. Thank you, Caroline, for a wonderful talk. And I think that is a great note on which to bring the Q&A to an end, and to thank you very, very warmly again, Caroline, for a fabulous talk, absolutely full of interest. Would you like to put up the next slide, please? That would be great. Thank you very much. And I should at this point say that if you'd like to join the Wallace Collections History of Collecting seminar list and receive our seminar programme for the rest of 2023, as well as receiving an abstract of each seminar in advance, then please do contact us at, let's see, I think we've got the email. Yeah, the email address you see at the bottom of this slide, collection@wallacecollection.org, and we can add you to our mailing list. Seminars on the history of collecting are going to continue on Zoom only until April. Our next seminar on the history of collecting will take place on Zoom at 5:30 on Monday, the 27th of March, when Thomas Cooper, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, is going to present his paper, Reconstructing the Art Collection of May Morris, 1862 to 1938. So once again, Caroline, thank you so much for your great lecture. And on behalf of the Wallace Collection, thank you all very much for attending this seminar. We hope to see you at future seminars, at other online Wallace Collection events, and of course in person at the Wallace Collection. Good evening.